everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Christopher Kerr, who is the CEO and Chief Medical Officer at the Hospice in Buffalo. And we've been talking about his book, Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End. And so in the book, you talk about interviewing over 1,400 patients over a decade-long study. Can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and do this
Sure.
research?
Sure. So in 1999, I was actually a cardiology fellow just working on weekends at a hospice for extra income. And I wasn't here very long, and I realized that I knew very little about not only caring for the dying, but what their experience was. And my colleagues in other disciplines, nursing, pastoral care, had this great appreciation for what the patient was going through. And one of the things that shocked me was that most were having these very intense dreams or visions towards the end of life. And I ignored it for the most part, but then was surprised at how remarkably therapeutic they were for not only the patient, but the family. And so then I was trying to teach it and was frustrated because there wasn't a lot of evidence for it out there from a medical perspective, and nobody had really taken a scientific view of it. So we that's what we did. We've done a series of studies, included videotaping the patients to ask them about what their experiences were as they neared the end of their life.
Yeah, and then you said that as part of, as they neared the end of their life, 80% had pre-death visions, which meant um, uh, well, actually, maybe I should have you explain. So there's actually either
Sure.
preparing to go, living, meaningful experiencing, seeing the deceased. Like what? Tell me a little bit about what you found through this
Sure.
research.
So basically, what we found was what we did is we. It's really important to clarify a couple things. So this we're not talking about the minutes before death when people are clearly confused. We're talking about days, weeks, months, and people were screened for confusion, and that's also why we videotaped them so you could actually see and interpret them. And we gave them a questionnaire every day that we did until death. And when we did that, almost 90% of people actually were reporting an intense experience that they either categorized as a dream or a vision. It wasn't so much that we saw them seeing things and their sleep cycle was fractured, so they're kind of in and out of awareness, but that they were having these experiences. And they were overwhelmingly comforting. And then there were certain thematics that were really clear. As they got closer to death, predominantly the dreams were of people who they knew they had loved and they had lost, and they were overwhelmingly comforting. When we actually asked them to measure comfort, those were the dreams that gave them the most comfort, and they increased in frequency dramatically towards the end.
Yeah.
Uh,
And just to clarify, so in your video you talked, so 72% of them saw deceased ones. So that may be, if I'm dying, I would see my grandmother who's passed, my grandfather who's passed, my dad who's passed. That would be
exactly.
what seeing a
Yes.
deceased one meant. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And very little is said between the dreamer and the person in the dream, but everything seems to be understood.
Hmm.
Time seems to be irrelevant, and the people who loved you correctly, nurtured you, loved you unconditionally, those were the ones who tended to appear, whereas those who compromised their love or conditioned their loves, they were excluded. So
Hmm.
it's not uncommon to find somebody in their 90s, for example, who may have lost a mother as a child. It's her voice they hear, it's her perfume they smell. It's just kind of, if you had to sum it up, it's kind of this return to wholeness. Whatever your injury was, whatever your loss was, it's often addressed in these experiences that, in the end, um, give your life meaning. They don't deny death at all. They just reduce the fear of it. They
Hmm.
lessen the fear of it. Another series of studies we did, we looked at dying as as a post-traumatic growth experience.
Hmm.
And what we found was really remarkable. There's this paradox. So you're physically declining, you're lessening, but psychologically and spiritually, you're very much alive and changing.
Hmm.
And when we looked at this in terms of this post-traumatic growth, people were actually adapting. They were gaining understanding, insight, right up until their very last days.
Hmm. Interesting. So even though there's a decline, there's a spiritual ascent, so to speak.
Yeah. Which can logically kind of makes sense. So if you were if at any time of your life, there's no time where your vantage point changes more,
Right.
both your perspective and your perceptions. You obviously are reflecting back on what has mattered, and what seems to happen is the things that matter most come to surface and return to us in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they're powerful. When we ask people to tell us to gauge the reality of it on a 0 to 10, with 10 being the most realistic, they said this was a 10.
Mm.
What we heard time and again was people say, "Well, I don't normally dream, or I don't remember my dreams, but this was very different."
Mm. I know that this is probably going to push your belief system, but I've talked to James Van Prague, who's a medium, and there are these people who claim to talk to dead people. And I've actually been in gigantic meetings where people are talking to their loved ones. And I think oftentimes it's instances when the person dies and it's an acute death where you don't have that sense of closure. Or alternatively, they can't communicate with their loved ones because they've lost all ability to communicate with their loved ones. The person can't talk. They don't know if they can really hear them.
Yeah.
And so, what's interesting, and it sounds very similar to when I was watching the videos and what people heard with their deceased ones, it's just there could be little things like, I've always loved you. Just that simple statement, or, I always thought the most of you, or I'm hoping, whatever it may be, these little simple statements seem to
You
do so
nailed it.
much. Yeah,
You,
and so
they,
that's what I heard. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, they tend. First of all, I should just clarify that. So we never viewed this as kind of a keyhole in which to look into the afterlife. So
Yeah, I know.
we were just looking at the patient's experience of dying as a mystery unto itself, not what happens after. But you nailed it. They usually the theme usually is that what's needed is given, whether it's reassurance, whether it's to be forgiven. So sometimes these aren't pleasant at all. They go to your deepest fear. So, a mother whose child is in prison questions her identity and everything. Her deceased parents come back to her and tell her she's a good mom.
Mm,
So whatever the injury is, it tends to be addressed. Whatever the need is, it tends to be addressed.
mm,
We had a fellow who lost his arm as a child and always wondered how he'd function and be independent. And at his deathbed, all of his coworkers come to him and tell him he was better at his job than everybody else. So
oh, wow.
the wounds tend to be addressed.
Yeah, and I know this is at post death, and not everyone believes this, but when I talk to James on Prague and other mediums, they talk about a life review process, where after you die, there's a kind of like review of everything that's happened in your life, both good and bad. And I was thinking about when in your TED video, you talk about 59% are preparing to go. 29% have like things, dreams about living, but it's kind of unfinished business. It seems that need to be resolved. In the video, you talk about someone who's in war, and it was kind of an unresolved thing, and it was almost tormenting the visions that he had, but he came to a resolution. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the preparing to go, and what that may look like.
Yeah, so you touched on an important point. People die as they live.
Mm,
So if you've had something that's profoundly regrettable, or even evil, it's not like that's denied. But we found about 17% of the dreams were actually discomforting. But some of the most discomforting dreams ended up being the most transformative. So the gentleman, for example, in the TED Talk, who's remarkable, and he's in the book, the family's interviewed. He was involved in the invasion of Normandy, and he was haunted for 67 years.
mm,
And he ended up coming into our inpatient unit, of course, towards the end of his life. He was seeing the blood and the bodies and the screaming. But what happens is he all of a sudden starts to sleep. And what happened, his dreams became comforting. He got to relive the day he got his discharge papers, which was the
mm.
happiest day of his life. And then soldiers came to him on a beach and said, "We're coming for you." And
Oh, wow, wow.
he was just kind of relieved of that the responsibility and burden he had carried for 67 years. And it's very hard to die if you can't sleep.
Yeah.
And to be able to, because that's where you let go, is in deep sleep. And to be able to sleep, people think of dying in terms of physical pain, but the psychogenic pain is actually worse for many people. So he was tormented, and after he had these experiences, he was finally able to relax and die peacefully.
And you said that did you say 70% of people have these hard
No, it's about 17%.
17%. Okay, 17%. And for those 17%, do all of them have a resolution like the gentleman who you just spoke of, or are some of them still in this kind of like roiling place of not accepting?
Yeah, for the most part, and there's a documentary that's coming out now on this work, as well as a Netflix production in the fall. And perhaps the most moving episode is actually about that. Is in the one in the film, the gentleman had been in and out of jail for most of his life. He was actually in jail more than out of his jail, and he was involved in some violent crimes. And he has this head and neck cancer, and he dreams that he's being stabbed at the site of his cancer.
Mm.
And what happened was he awoke from it, and he asked to see a daughter. And for the first time, he basically said he owned it. He said, "I'm sorry, and I love you very much."
Mm.
And so it was really transformative. So yeah, the vast majority of people, if the relief doesn't come in the dream, it causes a recognition or a need to resolve outside of the dream in waking life. Whether again, sometimes it's the need to say I'm sorry or that I love you.
Yeah, or I was wrong, and then please forgive me. It seems like when I've
Yeah,
talked to other people who are in hospice, those are the kinds of things that make a world of difference, right? Just saying, I'm sorry, or I
yeah.
wasn't there for you, I'm sorry. And you say that 29% of the people have these visions of the living. Is that what you meant by the daughter, or what's the visions of the living?
Well, they tend to change. So when you're farther out from dying, they tend to occur. They tend to include more of the living. So more life-bound concerns in the present. But as you get closer to dying, it's more of the deceased that come back to them.
Mm. And then you just had a really interesting stat. I don't know if I should say stat, but this idea that like people have more these dreams come more frequently when they're nearing death. I mean, is that one way of telling that like okay, you're gonna die soon?
Well, that's actually one of the things that started the study. Was when I first started at hospice, and this is how the book begins.
Yeah.
I I thought that we could give this gentleman who was dying of complications of HIV more time if we gave him fluid and antibiotics, etc. And the nurse, without looking up, said, "No, he's dying. He's seeing his deceased mom." And
Oh.
I thought that was the craziest thing I had heard. And then it turned out she was correct. When we followed people, and that's this one of the critical things we did in our studies. We just didn't fly by and check on them one day. We checked on them every day until death.
Mm.
And so you could see this pattern of this increasing frequency of these events that were actually predictive of death. Yeah.
Mm. And like, what's the increase of frequency? Like, what would it look like?
Oh, dramatically, like a fivefold increase over the 3 week interval as they approach death.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That, but you know what? That's so wonderful to know. I mean, as hard as that is to face someone's death, it's like, okay, we're nearing, my loved one is seeing deceased people, they're nearing their death so that everyone can kind of prepare for that 3 weeks versus seeing those people. And one of the things that you said in the video was seeing those people as having being confused or like on drugs or that's why they're coming up with these crazy dreams. I mean,
Yeah.
how did that change after that nurse said that to you and you got all this research? How are you now holding these visions or the process of dying differently?
But what it did for me, I think, more than anything, is I entered this work viewing dying as a medical equation
Mm.
that needed to be addressed. And what you end up understanding is that actually medicine is off to the side and nature takes over. And really, dying is more about not about organs and parts failing, it's about closing of a life.
Mm. Wow.
And that's a profoundly human experience. And that changes it entirely. So, for me personally, as the doctor, um, it's less about their heart function, their blood pressure, but more what their going through at an experiential level.
Mm.
And, and what is it they're seeing and feeling and perceiving, and are they comfortable? Are they distressed? What do they need to say or not say? It's much more about the subjective than the objective.
Mm.
It's not the measurables, it's what's felt. That's what matters.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a hard question, which is you're facing your own death now. For whatever reason you're not doing well. How are
Thanks.
you personally? I don't wish this upon you.
Like these times aren't shitty enough. Yeah.
I mean, what? How are you going to go navigate this differently, knowing what you know, that this is appearance of potential spiritual transcendence, that this is, I mean, and that it's not a scary thing, but just a shift of state.
Yeah.
How are you going to
Well,
go through it differently?
I think, and I'm the last guy, by the way, to believe this. I have no
Okay.
natural predilection for any of this. Like when you mentioned mediums, I got nervous.
I know, I could tell.
I No, I think that I think there's a better story than emptiness. And I think that I love the idea that what matters most isn't lost. So that those people, may have been 60 years ago, that were integral to who you are returned somehow to you. That there's this connectivity, and the bind that ties is love, between and across the lives that we've known. And I think that's a better version.
You mentioned the continuity of generation to generation. It's not like the baton is truly passed, right?
Oh
Which is,
gosh, no. So you'll see a child, by me, a child, somebody who's in their 40s or 50s, looking at their mother, who's experiencing the love and familiarity of their mother.
mm,
So you see it across generations, and it's, although that person's dead, the love that they left or gave is still ever present, and
mm,
and that's what seems to come to surface. So it matters a great deal.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that you're still scared of dying?
Oh hell yeah, yeah,
Knowing all that you know, you still feel scared of dying?
yeah. Because it's innate.
Mm,
We wouldn't be here as a species if we didn't fight like hell for survival and run like hell from death.
yeah.
Uh, we would have walked up to the saber-toothed tiger and petted it. I
Right.
mean, you know, yeah, yeah,
You're saying
yeah,
it's biological. We're just programmed to
yeah,
want to fight.
yeah, right. And to fight for those that we're responsible for,
Yeah.
children. So that's innate. That can't be denied. So no, I'm as scared as the next person.
But what I love is that, but what I love going back to what we talked about in the first segment, if you actually put a reality filter on it, yes, I'm going to fight like heck. I'm scared of death. But at the
Yeah,
same time, I know realistically that I'm not going to the empty, dark null. I'm going to a place where my loved ones will be. I'm going to one where I'm actually going to spiritually transcend some of my greatest fears and hardships in my life will be transformed potentially
yeah,
if I allow it. I mean, there's something beautiful about that process of transformation from body to soul that I
yeah,
think, yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah.
we are so fixated on living with whatever things we need to address in the present.
Hmm.
And when we're unburdened of that, and you're lying in your bed towards the end of the life, and you don't care where your car keys are, or whether your bill was paid, you know, what ends up mattering is you then have a different vantage point. You reflect naturally on this full scope of your life, the one you've got to let go of, and what comes back to you are the things that seem to matter.
Yeah.
So that's yeah, there's kindness in there.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you said was dying includes more than a physical suffering that we observe. There's a better, less fearful aspect to the end of life, one that validates that life led lessens the fear of death and often returns us to those that we have loved the most. And what when I read that, I thought what's interesting about this is okay, well maybe we maybe you and I live. We live through this. Let's
We
put it.
survived.
We
Yeah.
survive, okay? So we've survived, but we've actually, in some ways, had a metaphorical death. Like we have experienced the grips of death in this whole coronavirus. So, in that same spirit of what you said, how can we actually take from this experience a new way? How can this transform us to live a more loving life, to connect with the ones that we love more? You know, are there ways in which this crisis can actually bring us to a higher place than where we were before?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested to see how this pans out, but as a society and a culture, I wouldn't be surprised if it has a transformative aspect to it.
Yeah.
Simply the fact that we have to unplug a bit and focus. I mean that's generational.
Yeah.
The grandparents used to hang out in their house and around the table. We
Yeah.
haven't we haven't done that. We're perpetually distracted, and so yeah. And I think a lot of us are suffering what the hell to do with ourselves.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I hope there's, again, this is the idea of kind of traumatic growth. So this is a horrid, fearful time, but there's also growth opportunity and adaptation within it, I think.
Yeah. This has been a lovely conversation. We've been talking, yeah, because I got to have you talk about death, your favorite topic, and then your
Yeah,
own
right.
death.
And my own. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad I just dragged you there.
Yeah.
Weren't expecting that, right?
No.
All right, we've been talking to Dr. Christopher Kerr. We've been talking about his book, Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End. He is a CEO and Chief Medical Officer in the Hospice at Buffalo. Thank you so much for being
Thank you.
here.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show and love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.